Dr. Jane Park is author of a fabulous book called Yellow Future: Oriental Style in 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 Hollywood cinema. I'm just reading behind me there. I thought it was like American cinema, Hollywood. Jane, how are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you, Paul?
Sorry for fluffing your subtitle. It's such a great book. We met shortly after it was published,
Right.
and we talked a lot about it then. But and it was I think it was it 2010 it came out? I think
Yeah, so it's been a decade,
yeah, it was
actually.
my favorite book of 2010, and
Oh,
I still
thanks.
refer to it now. It taught me a lot about the kind of the crossover in aesthetics and
Mm,
in styles between Hollywood action cinema and Hong Kong action cinema.
mm.
Um, I mean, would you do you, so your argument? I mean, your argument's complex. Can you sum up that argument in just a bite size for people who haven't read the book?
Sure. It's been a while, so the book the book really looks the at the time the increasing visibility and popularity of East Asian aesthetics and actors in mainstream Hollywood genre films. So I really focused on the book is bookended by Blade Runner from 1982, and then it ends with the original Matrix, which is now being remade in 1999. So what I do is I then sort of look at other films between those years. Like I looked at The Karate Kid, which is also, as you know, has had an up,
Remade in many ways. Yeah.
which I hope we can talk about, Cobra Kai,
Oh yeah.
and the Rush Hour movies. I think I had a little bit about Kill Bill Volume One, and Ghost Dog, that fabulous, Joe
Mm.
Musch film with Forest Whitaker. So I honestly, when I was writing the book, it was really, I don't know if I told you this, Paul, but when I got the readers' reports back, so for those of you who are listening who don't know, when you write an academic book, it gets sent out to anonymous readers in your field, and they give you like a sort of, they give back a report and say that you should publish this, whatever. But one of the comments that I got, people were like, "This is a fantastic study of Asian masculinities," and I was like, I hadn't even thought about that. That's what I was doing. Because I was just writing about movies that I really loved, and that where I really saw this pattern illuminated, right? That
Mhm.
kind of spectacular East Asian bodies as aesthetics, like as spectacle, and also in the background in the mise en scène. So you look at, lots of people have written about this, but um, the ways that Blade Runner, and now the remake that came out recently, I imagine it was the same thing we'll see in Dune, but so many science fiction films in the West have as their backdrop for a dystopic future a very kind of multicultural Asian dominant sort of look. So that's something else I was looking at in this book. And what I tried to do, I basically used a cultural studies approach, which I also didn't know I was doing. I thought I was just doing close readings of these films and contextualizing them within things like interviews with the directors, and what was happening in the United States at the time in terms of how Asian Americans were being perceived, and really you're looking from the 80s to the beginning of this century, or the end of the last century,
Yeah.
which seems like a really long time ago now. You're looking at the rise of quote unquote Asia, first with Japan, and then after the Asian economic recession, you see China rising, and I
Mhm.
didn't cover it in my book, but then India with Bollywood,
Mhm.
and then in the 2000s, it's been Korea. So it's really been about Hallyu and K-pop, and
Mhm.
so yeah, that was a long answer to your question. I hope
Yeah,
that
no,
gives you a as
that
well.
that's great. One of the things that really stuck with me was the argument that in terms of kind of Hollywood motifs and aesthetics, that 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 Asia generally, but maybe China specifically, would stand for the most ancient and timeless and mystical, but also the technological future. So
Yes.
you look at the character in Blade Runner who makes the eyes, the guy who is
Right.
killed. I only make the eyes. I only make the eyes. And it's like there's that connection that's kind of overdetermined by, first of all, structures of Orientalism, like it's the ancient and timeless and mystical, but also then by the move post World War II for say Japan to redefine itself as a tech world. And that comes through in so many times in so many ways, and you see the characters who represent either the ancient and timeless or the most futuristic. It's
Exactly.
interesting. Do you think that's
It
still
is.
the case now? Do we still see that?
Um, I think so. Yeah, I actually think that a lot of the tropes and the patterns that I identified in that time period, we've just seen coming to the foreground even more, and getting naturalized even further. So I had been talking, I mean, one of the things I guess that speaks to martial arts studies is really, during the period that I was looking at is when, with the crossover of so many Hong Kong actors and directors and so on to the United States, and that following the popularity of anime, right? So you have a growing audience, a fan base in the West, interested in just lost my train of thought, but basically these martial arts and anime and kind of this extreme Asia thing. And I'm so sorry.
Well, it's okay,
been
because we were talking about whether you think that it's still relevant, whether it's still growing, or whether it's because
yeah,
in many ways the kind of the action and the martial arts aesthetic in films has become
it's normal.
often
This is what,
disconnected.
yeah, no, that's what I was going to say, actually. Sorry, I remembered what I was going to say is that during that time, you really see things like wire fu becoming part of the Hollywood industry. Like that's how action is shot. Before that, you compare people like, Stallone or Schwarzenegger. They weren't fighting in the ways that we now sort of see as fight sequences, So I was really interested in that. So, I mean, what do you think, Paul? Do you feel like, this kind of techno-oriental style that I was talking about, is you see that now in
Yeah, I
film?
think, I mean, I don't get as much, well, maybe I just don't have as much inclination. I've said don't get as many opportunities to watch films, but maybe I just don't want to watch as many films. Because now with, I've had Netflix for the last couple of years, and you look at the offerings on Netflix, and they seem like really simplified. I mean, the action choreography, the fight choreography is often really wonderful and as good as any Hong Kong choreography ever was. But the Orientalism is just straightforward, and it's just simplistic, and it's really childish. And maybe it's the childishness that I can't cope with, and that turns me off. I start watching series or seasons and box set type things and just go, oh, this is so juvenile. I can't. Maybe I'm
Like
too
what?
old.
I'm curious. Like I'm wondering what you're watching. Like, what do you mean the Orientalism that's really so like over the top? What are some examples?
Well, let me try and think. If I'm trying visualizing myself scrolling endlessly through
Right.
Netflix recommendations. Those series, there was like Marco Polo. It's almost like
Oh, yeah, yeah,
everything
yeah.
since The Great Wall. That film.
Oh
Everything
gosh,
since
yeah,
then seems to have taken the worst aspects of that and
right.
distilled it into ever more regurgitations of the same. But I'm simplifying because, as I say, I have no stomach for these films anymore, and this style of
I totally get it. I mean, that's probably why I haven't written a sequel to it.
yeah, it just got more simple. It just got simplified.
Or it just got more maybe cartoonish is another
Yes.
word for it, or just it's also become pure spectacle. I think
Mm,
that's it for me. I think a lot of cinema, this genre has become pure spectacle,
yeah.
and I just get bored. Like, what's the plot? It's either too spectacular and there's no plot and no character development, or it's just too much for me. Like, I mean, I love time travel movies, I'm into science fiction, but now, I mean, you can't watch a film in that genre that doesn't have time loops and multiple
Yeah.
narratives and characters. So,
Yeah.
but perhaps that just reflects the interesting age that we're living in. Like,
Yeah.
we're living in Groundhog Day, with the
Well,
pandemic.
yeah, and
So,
this is the thing. I mean, even with stuff that's massively unexpectedly popular, like like Cobra Kai, we talked about. So that the
Yeah.
first, episode 1, season 1, the first 3 episodes, 4 episodes, they're a delight. They're a nostalgic, playful, hilarious, messing around with things that were left dangling, and we didn't even know there were threads left dangling in the film. And
Yeah.
then by season 2, it's like, I was watching it with my wife and my daughter, and me and my daughter, we stuck with it. We loved it. But my wife's like, oh, this is just now it's just a kind of childish teen
Yeah.
program where people are going through the same dramas that they went through in 1983 or 1984, whenever it was. And so she just lost interest, because that whole there's something marvelous about bringing it back to life was lost, and it became a simplified teen soap opera again, really, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of like that sort of, and I'm showing my age here because I'm Gen X, but that kind of snowflake millennial thing, that I got that vibe in the second season as well. And of course, I'm identifying, I don't know if I should say this, like I totally identify with William Zabka, right? Like the guy who's, Johnny from Cobra Kai. I thought the actor was amazing. I mean, Ralph Macchio was fine, but like I love all underdog narratives. So, for this guy, he's like, his whole life was ruined after the tournament. To go back and revisit those scenes from the Karate Kid from his perspective, that was gold. I loved that. I wanted to ask you though, because you probably didn't see this thing, but I'm really interested in how, given the fact that I wrote, Yellow Future, and like I'm always looking at how Asian characters are represented or not or whatever. So I found it so fascinating that in Cobra Kai first season, we get introduced to, the popular crowd. And the guy who's leading the popular crowd is this Asian American guy. And I was like, as I was watching it, I thought, I know this guy from somewhere, and his name is Joseph Sell. He's Korean American. So even before I knew he was a Korean American, I was like, I bet that's capitalizing on how, Korean culture and K-pop is so cool now. So now Asian guys are cool via K-pop, right? Like that's a whole, people have written about how Korean masculinity, and I see it in my students. But what's really interesting to me is he starts out, so he's basically the new Johnny, in our age. And then I don't want to give it away to people who haven't watched it, but then like, he's dating, what's his face's daughter,
Russo's daughter,
the Russo's daughter. And he turns out to be a real jerk, but there's this awesome scene where LaRusso invites this kid whose name I'm forgetting to dinner. And it's like they're making fun of Orientalism,
it's
right?
The best, isn't it? It's so funny.
But there's so many like loops to that. Anyway, but so he invites him, and he's like all decked out in some sushi chef outfit, and he's like, "Oh, of course you like sashimi." And the guy's like, "No, I don't like fish."
Yeah.
and then his daughter's like, "No, you like fish sticks." So they have to like make him these frozen fish sticks. It's so American. Yeah. But the thing, and then when Daniel LaRusso asks him, so where are you from, or where are your parents from?
Where are your parents from? He goes, Irvine, I guess.
Irvine. And I was like, that is the best this is like such a beautiful scene of Asian American resistance to being Orientalized, Yeah. But then that character totally falls away, and he's sort of relegated to the background. So it is interesting that even though the series has this amazing critique of Orientalism, you could argue that it reproduces it as well, right? Because like in the end, everybody who is doing stuff is
I thought, hang on a minute, because I totally identified with Johnny. I think that was the thing that they really mined the reserves of. Like Cobra Kai were cool, right? They were badass, as they say, all the way through, and we all knew that. But because bad guys, they often are badass, like Spike in Buffy, he's cool and he's attractive in that. But I liked the way that they played, because at first I thought, oh no, Daniel LaRusso is he's like the archetypal Western sort of hippie who really thinks that so he's trying to teach the wisdom and also the culinary delights of Okinawa to his Asian guy. But then But then when he does his advert, when he decides he's setting up Miyagi-Do again, and he does an advert online, and he's at work, and the guy goes, "Oh, by the way, I don't think you're guilty of cultural appropriation." And he gets his phone, and he goes, "What?"
You're like, what is this? What is this? Yeah, it gets dismissed. Yeah, there were some really funny moments. But I agree. I mean, the second season, I just kind of lost interest as well. I do think they did a really good job sort of bringing out the nostalgic factors in the first season, though, and I enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think that. What do I think? I mean, I think a lot of things about it. I do think that they recouped some of the nostalgic kind of vibe towards the end. The very last scene. Oh, I shouldn't really spoil it for anyone, but the very last scene of the very last episode of the second season, they're going to bring some more back, other aspects, which are going to be replayed. Yeah, there's been a lot of interest in the. So on my in my bubble, in my online hall of mirrors, my echo chamber, a lot of the martial artists who I am in contact with, they love that. I mean, they are absolutely thrilled by Cobra Kai. Like really often serious, sober, older martial artists, like really respectable. They want to talk about it, and they want to write about it and reflect on it. It's interesting the way that it taps a martial arts nerve as well.
It does. Well, because it's also, you can see there's a nostalgia for when, and you know this history so much better than I. Like not that I have any time because our teaching workload has tripled. That's a whole nother neoliberal corporate university thing. But if I had time, I really want to learn more about the history of martial arts centers opening up in the US and elsewhere. You probably have written about this and I don't remember, but and so it's really in the 80s that karate becomes such a cool normalized thing, right? For all just like the Karate Kid. And then a friend of mine who, her family was one of the first group of Korean immigrants to come to the United States, to Hawaii. It turns out that her uncle, I'm forgetting his name, but he was a really, really famous Taekwondo. I've been meaning to tell you this. I'll find the name later, but Taekwondo instructor. I think he opened up the first Taekwondo studio and I think trained Elvis Presley or something. Okay. So I mean, so it's interesting that kind of, that nostalgia for a kind of Asian cultural form that's become such an integral part of, American and Western masculinity, culture.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I haven't written about the actual history of clubs and schools opening in any country, but I know people who have. And I mean, Hawaii was always a hotbed. It was always one of the first locations for anything. But people like Joseph Smith and Tom Green and people have done these histories of clubs opening and the movement of these styles around. But what's interesting is, so a colleague and friend of mine called Mike Molaski, who teaches in Waseda University in Tokyo, he's done a study of phone books, adverts, to look for martial arts clubs in 3 big cities around the US. And it really is the 1980s where it becomes a definitive thing, and they start to use terms like martial arts, because before that it would be different styles and there'd be the chopstick writing and all, but it's really quite late. It's so these things like the Karate Kid, they are happening at the time precisely at the time this is becoming normalized, and they are the things that are normalizing it and really multiplying the effects of what was already taking place. So we tend to think that we think of the Karate Kid as belated, don't we? Like, it's like, oh, but it really happened in the 70s. But actually, the cinematic happened in the 70s, as we know. It was like, boom, kung fu fighting. But it took a long time for actual practice to magnify to the extent that the film suggested it already existed.
Right. And for it to infiltrate among youth, right? Because it becomes a thing for kids to train, right?
And then it becomes childish. Which is destiny, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to write about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in my book back in the day, but yeah, that kind of the way, and it goes all the way to Marco Polo, like you said, and where we are now, maybe. There's this is a random, I should talk about what I'm working on now, but anyway, but I just remembered something I wanted to tell you. So,
Yeah.
I moved to Australia in 2008, and one of the martial arts things I learned is that they have this martial art here called Zendo Kai.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I remember do you know about this? And they totally made it up. Some, it would be such a fun thing to investigate, like some guy in the 80s came up with this idea of Zendo Kai, and then all these white Australian kids started taking Zendo
There's
Kai.
a lot of it about. There's a lot of it. I mean, it's not just whatever ethnicity Australians. It's people make up new. I mean, what does Master Ken teach? Emeridote. That happens regularly. I mean, the Chinese do it regularly with things that they can control, like Mulan Chuan. Well, you wanted to talk about Mulan as well, didn't you? So according to anthropologist called Adam Frank, when the not the much the qigong, the Falun Gong controversy was taking place in China, and they were arresting all these Falun Gong practitioners, they would replace them. They'd bus in martial artists to do Tai Chi in the park, and that's where Mulan Chuan became so popular, because it was kind of endorsed by the state, and they invented a 1,000-year history for it. But really, it was just sort of invented there and then to look beautiful and to appeal to American tourists.
There you go.
And this brings us to Mulan, and it's many incarnations.
Yeah.
You recently took some time to seek out Mulan, didn't you? What did you think about the new Mulan?
I didn't actively seek it out. Everybody kept telling me to watch it, and then a very good friend of mine who works in the film industry, was like, "Hey, I'm going to watch it. I'm going to screen it at home. You want to come and join us?" So, I mean, it's been completely trashed, I think, in the US and in China, from what I've read. So there are all the sort of political things that happened with the lead actress supporting the Chinese police, But yeah, the film itself, this is not my genre. I don't like musicals very much. I mean, I watched the original Mulan, but, and I know that this is the thing that's happening where they're bringing back Disney films, but in live action, and they usually keep the musical aspects, but they didn't keep the musical aspect in Mulan, and lead actress just is extremely wooden. Every time you're watching her, it's like, you can just see her trying to remember her English lines. Do you know what I mean?
Like, yeah.
The martial arts, I'm not the expert here, you are, but I mean, they were very short, short sequences. The CGI was pretty bad. I mean, Gong Li has an interesting kind of role that's new to the remake, where she plays a quote unquote witch, and I mean, there's potential for some really interesting relationship stuff, kind of surrogate mother-daughter or doubling between her and Mulan, but it doesn't really happen very well. Lots of plot holes. So yeah, overall, it really didn't keep my interest.
Okay.
I don't know, but then I'm not the tween audience that I suppose it was going for. I also think it didn't know what its audience was, in many ways. And so it's every time I watch a movie like that, I'm just like, that is so sad. You put all that money into that movie, and so I mean, what's the panda movie? Kung Fu Panda is so much better.
Okay.
The Kung Fu Panda series.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's my quick commentary on that.
Okay. Yeah. Don't waste your money on subscribing to Disney Plus or whatever. Just my daughters were really keen for me to subscribe to that channel, because the only way to get it in Britain was to subscribe to another channel, which I don't want, and then pay something like £18 to rent it. And I was like, is it worth it really? When I know I'm going to hate it.
You'll hate it. I went in thinking I would hate it, but I went in with an open mind, and
hoping not to hate it that much. Yeah.
No, exactly. I was like, but I'll give it they should just watch the original Mulan. It's so much better.
So what are you working on at the moment then? What's the thing?
So after that book came out, after Yellow Future came out, I really wanted to, this is what I was talking with you about many, many years ago when we met. I wanted to kind of look at the globalization of Korean popular culture, film and TV, and particularly kind of focusing on the idea of crossovers and remakes. So the ways in which, you know, Korean styles kind of get remade in different Asian contexts. So I wrote a couple of things in that area. And in fact, one of the papers that I started writing a while ago that I really need to finish this year and just send off to a journal is looking at a Korean film that came out in 2001 and then has been remade many, many, many times, all the way up to 2011 in Malaysia. And it's called My Wife is a Gangster. And have you seen it, Paul?
I don't think so, no. I don't
Okay,
think so.
I think you might enjoy it.
Does it have different titles, different versions? I don't
No,
think so. It doesn't ring a bell.
yeah, it's a comedic gangster film.
Okay.
Did really well when it came out in Korea. The main character is a female mob boss, and
Sounds like it's got a lot going for it already. I'm
it
interested.
does. Yeah, it's quite good. And I would be curious to hear what you think of the fighting style, because you know there's like a really interesting mixture I thought of that of kind of wuxia and like hardcore Korean street fighting. And then so in the paper I talk about the ways in which, you know, those kinds of Chinese aesthetic connections get echoed in the sequels, where you have sort of more like Hwagyo, the Chinese Korean element, I say, is sort of a backdrop. And then the third sequel is actually a co-production with Hong Kong, I think. And I'm forgetting the name of the very famous Chinese actress who plays the lead. But anyway, so it's really interesting. And then several years later, it gets remade in Singapore and Malaysia. So I was really interested in these kinds of cross-cultural connections and divergences. So that was like kind of the area that I wanted to go into. And the book was just too unwieldy and long, and life happened. So I'm still fascinated by just the idea of remakes and sequels, because that is our world, right? Like we were just talking about Cobra Kai, and maybe it's my age too, but I just feel like we're living in a perpetual loop of constant remaking, you know? But I haven't articulated that into a project per se. At the moment, I'm just finishing up some projects, and then the book project as is, I've decided to just sort of center on film and television primarily, texts around sort of this figure of the transgressive Korean and Korean diasporic woman. So not a lot with martial arts, but a lot of violent women, which I'm interested in.
Women, okay.
Quite cathartic to watch Korean women breaking things. And it's interesting because actually in my area, I was talking with a friend about this. You know, we talk about race and affect. And when you think about anger as an affect, it's in gender studies or feminist studies, we think of like angry African-American women or angry Latinas or angry, you know, they're always Black and brown women. And Asian women, anger doesn't really show up in the Western discourse, right? Usually Asian women, it's like, we're really sad. We're really depressed, you know? And so for me, I think I'm personally and emotionally connected. And I also just love action, right? But I love seeing Asian and Korean women totally lose their shit. I like them showing that anger because I don't see that represented in Asian diasporic contexts as much, you know? Maybe I'm just an angry person, I don't know.
No, I mean, there were films like The Assassin, and then, I mean, the first person that jumps to mind would be Oren Ishii in
Of course.
Bill. Yeah. I mean, she's sublimated that anger and turned it into something rather special.
Yeah.
Speaking of, just quickly on remakes, so one of my all-time favorite films, bar none, is the Korean film Old Boy, and then it was remade by Spike Lee.
Right.
And I thought that, you know, I often find myself shouting things like at the radio or and I was like shouting to myself about how there should be legislation. There should be certain things that you are not allowed to remake, because you take one of the best films ever made one of the most amazing films where every camera angle, every frame does something to develop the themes and the plot. And then Spike Lee comes along and makes it into some lame,
I know.
peculiar. I mean, if you're going to remake a film, you don't remake one of the greatest films of all time. What did you think? Did you like the Spike Lee
No,
version?
I did not either. I also shout at the TV, and I remember not enjoying that. But it was mitigated by the fact that I had watched the Indian remake
Okay.
of, of Old Boy, which is even worse. It's called Zinda, if you ever are in the mood for a really bad remake.
Ever feeling strong, yeah.
If you're feeling strong. And there's also just horrible, it's just, there's like, I think there's a rape scene. It's just terrible on every level. I think there was music in it too. I think they tried to make it like a Bollywood Old Boy, but anyway, it did not work.
Yeah.
Um,
For,
so
for,
yeah, maybe that's another reason I just gave up on the remake thing, because there's just so many bad remakes
I find
after a
myself
while.
nowadays, when it comes to like, do you want to watch this film? See, I do this, I started doing this type of stuff where you do cold exposure training. So I always have cold showers now. So I'm like looking at the shower going, I'm going to get in the shower and it's going to be very, very cold. And for me, like watching a film is like that now. Going, "Oh, I know this is going to be awful, but I'm going to have to do this for the sake of, I'm meant to teach film studies.
Because you have to, okay. You just lost interest in film, or is it more, because I find I'm watching television a lot more. I feel like TV is a lot more interesting than film these days.
Well, I think that, I mean, I teach a module on called film and cultural theory, but I'm very, very, very flexible in my categories. I'll often look at, say, music videos or adverts because I
Oh,
think that what the category film is probably had its day, because a film can quite easily warp into a series, into all different kinds of media. It becomes games, it becomes.
video games.
So I think that to think in terms of film studies it's passé really, because it has
Yep,
to be a generalized media studies now, doesn't it? Otherwise you're missing the world. The world goes by and you're
totally.
still fixated on 2 hour long texts.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're living in the age of convergence, like you're describing. You can't talk about film as a separate category anymore. Um, and I had another thought and I totally lost it. TikTok.
Oh yeah,
Hey, so
yeah.
Trump's going to ban TikTok, but I'm at the point where I'm like, I jokingly suggested to my students in a course I'm teaching on globalization
Mhm.
that, in their final project, they basically have carte blanche to do whatever they want, really, that speaks to the themes of the class. They can write a traditional academic essay or they can do something creative. And I was like, they were like, what can we do that's creative? And I said, well, you can do some TikTok videos if you want, and then just do an analysis, using the readings. But that's kind of where I'm at. Like,
Yeah.
my own attention span is like the attention span of a TikTok video.
Yeah, yeah. There is that. I mean,
So
with me, I think that when I was trying to articulate my interest in martial arts and trying to conceptualize it and put it in and communicate it to the academic world, Bruce Lee films are the obvious place to start for me. But really, my interest has always been in the kind of bodily experiences and the fantasy life associated with that, and the attempts to put that into words. So now I spend more time. Well, I spend more time training and thinking thinking about training, but but also I'm interested in I like to read people's. I read a lot of discourse around it and try to, well, which way are people thinking about these things, and what tropes and what figures are they using to communicate something that I intuitively feel I have a direct and mediated access to because I do it,
because of
which
the
is a
training.
problematic proposition in its own right. But with like the stuff that I've got into during lockdown, which is around different forms of breathing and meditation and pranayama and so on,
Yes.
that produces certain emotional and psychological and physiological responses that I'm very interested in how people think about that. I mean,
That's
obviously
really
it's a symptom of the
interesting.
pandemic, but so
Yeah.
I'm not really a film person at the moment, I think.
No, that's so interesting that you say that. It's really cool to reconnect, because I've been getting hardcore into meditation the past 3 or 4 years. And I'm always like, oh, I should pick up a martial art. And I started doing Tai Chi, you know, to supplement the yoga. And so I've kind of become a caricature of myself in a way. If the 20-year-old me met me now, she would laugh and laugh, you know.
What's it,
But
Ray
it's
calls it? Coercive mimeticism.
yeah,
You become what you were expected to be.
probably maybe perhaps. But it's been a form of, I don't really like the word resistance necessarily, but it's been a really wonderful way to cope with the stresses of modern life and with academia, and also to get back into into my body, you know, because academic work is so cerebral, and that mind body split, it's just it's untenable, you know. So meditation's been fantastic. um, I forgot to tell you, the last thing I published was a book, not a book, I wish, was an article on pedagogy. And I use Bruce Lee, actually, and his sort of theorization of water to
Mm.
think about my own positionality as somebody who is kind of watery and invisible in terms of her identity here in Australia. You know, so all the ways in which being in Australia has made me question sort of identity categories in politics that I had in the United States, and what it might feel like to be, you know, this kind of double translation.
Okay, that I'll read that. That's really interesting. I mean, the
Awesome.
water thing, the Bruce Lee and the Be Water thing was really, it had a new existence around the Hong Kong protests, didn't it? I mean,
Exactly.
last
Yeah.
year and the start of this year. It's really coming back in a big. Well, it did. It came back. But I'll read. Where was that one published then?
It was in a journal called Interasia Cultural Studies,
Oh yeah,
which,
yeah,
you know, my senior colleague Megan Morris like
yeah.
is one of the founders of that group. But it came out in a special issue last year. I can send you a copy. No worries.
Okay,
Or
excellent. Let the swapping of PDFs begin.
yes. And I want. What have you been working on?
Well,
Besides,
I finished a book that will be out in December, and it is called The Invention of Martial Arts, and the subtitle is Popular Culture Between Asia and America. And I had a lot of projects, and most of my research was around the discourse of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and also some stuff around representations of Chinese martial arts like Tai Chi in British media. But then the pandemic hit and lockdown hit, and I had a complete kind of existential crisis because Jiu-Jitsu was taken away from me, and I was locked in the house with my family, and I flailed around for a long time. So at the moment, I'm totally open to I'm thinking there's no hurry to find a new
that's
research project. I need to come to terms with the indefinite loss of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from my life. But I'm just kind of open. This is part of what the podcast is about. It's about, like, I just want to speak to people and think and kind of connect with other people and see how they're coping with things. And I think the
yeah,
number of people who are turning to breathing, posture, and meditation it makes sense given what's happening globally.
absolutely.
A symptom
Yeah,
in the kind of Lacanian sense, but it's also
definitely.
ideological in the sense it's coping. We have to cope somehow, don't we? So,
Yeah, and I think it's just recognizing that we don't have control of
mm,
our lives, which is a fact. We just forget it, you know, when we live, we plan things. And I've also, you know, God, my colleagues would just laugh at me, but you know, I also started like reading Eckhart Tolle and Pema Chodron and Deepak, you know, Chopra, and like just thinking about how I've been thinking a lot about sort of the constructedness of time, yeah, just time, you know. And we're kind of, I feel like we're living in a really interesting period. And rather than freaking out, just thinking, you know, I don't know, I just suddenly thought of Gramsci's idea of interregnum, where the old is dying but hasn't died yet, and the new is yet to be born. I feel like we're entering a new epoch. So
just feel a bit like that, yes.
yeah, so just kind of, I think just being grounded in your breath and, you know, being grateful for every day. I have a dog. I mean, that's my biggest thing. I got a puppy a few years ago.
I think that my dog is the only thing keeping my family together. To be honest, he's like we might as well have
Nice.
called him therapy dog.
Yeah, exactly. What breed is your dog?
My dog is a Chihuahua.
No way. I
Really
feel like
my
you
wife's
told me this
dog.
and I forgot. Yeah,
Cherry,
my, my,
powerful.
mine is like, we could share our dogs, but yeah.
Yeah,
My dog
my
is
dog is.
stereotypically white fluffy dog.
But I feel like we've drifted away from the topic
Yeah.
of the podcast. So I guess uh, should I ask? So what is next, Dee? I mean, what's the next big project for you then? What's the next big thing?
Um, so the book, the academic book I'm supposedly writing right now, is tentatively titled Extreme Women,
Mm.
a kind of play on extreme Asia,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then I think it's something like Korean femininities in popular culture, in global popular culture. So I would look at figures like Sandra Oh, you know, Margaret Cho. I would read films like Cloud Atlas, and it's really a kind of examination. I guess it's like in between a star study and a kind of diaspora Asia anger affect aesthetic study. So I'm totally botching that up. But you know, okay, but at the moment, I've got the proposal and whatever, but I'm just not that into it. So I did some work a while ago on Korean beauty culture and cosmetic surgery, and that never eventuated in an academic study. And so I'm sort of playing with the idea of writing it more sort of as creative nonfiction, you know,
Okay.
exploring my own body issues and, you know, stuff around diaspora and beauty. And I would call it very cheekily the guide to Korean beauty. And
Okay.
make,
That
yeah,
sounds interesting. I think a lot of us are thinking about writing in different styles and different modes of address.
yeah.
You know, that makes I recognize that interest. But I think that we've talked for a while, so I'm gonna say thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. The
No
conversation
worries.
went forward. Thank you, Jane. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thank you, Paul. It was really nice to catch up.